So having understood the concept of environmental history, let us try to see what are the major themes in environmental history, or in other words, what is it that environmental history tries to study, what environmental historians do, what do they study. Let us try to see how environmental history exists in different civilizations or different societies. Perhaps it is in America that environmental history exists as a well established branch of knowledge. American environmental history dates back to 1970s, which emerged as a response to the growing environmental movements of the period. We may identify two broad themes in environmental history of America. One, documentation and analysis of socio-cultural consequences of colonization and capitalism. In other words, the first element of American environmental history focuses on colonial exploitation or focuses on colonial encounter with the American nature or with American forest, and it tries to see that how colonization of America, even though for a brief period, and emergence of capitalism has influenced, has altered the nature in the American context. Secondly, American environmental history also focuses on celebration of individuals and organizations who have challenged environmental degradation unleashed by the colonialism and capitalism. In that sense, there is a little bit of, in that sense, there is a kind of iconization of certain personalities, of certain individuals in American environmental history who have struggled, who have significantly contributed to or who have significantly challenged the environmental destruction created by colonization and or colonialism and capitalism. In other words, American environmental history focuses on impact of colonial control of American nature or colonial exploitation of nature, and in the latter time impact of capitalism on nature. So in that sense, American environmental history makes an historical analysis of environmental movements that has emerged in America, especially from 60s or especially after the Cold War, and how environmental history captures or how environmental history has pointed out towards the negative impacts of the process of industrialization. So the major focus of American environmental history has been the historical analysis of emerging environmental movements, the individuals, the organizations which played an important role in unleashing, or which played an important role in challenging the environmental degradation unleashed by the process of colonialism and capitalism. But when we come to see when we see the environmental history in the European context, perhaps the background is little different. The European environmental history focuses more on the agrarian European society. So therefore there is a close interconnection or balance between history and geography in the European context. While American environmental history is mostly a response to the rising environmental movements in 1970s, European environmental history focuses more on emergence of the agrarian society in Europe and how the agrarian society has interacted with that of nature. So in that sense, European environmental history focuses on appreciation of fundamental importance of environmental factors to an understanding of the agrarian society. So the focus on European context is on the agrarian society or the agrarian Europe and how it has evolved in relationship with nature, how it has changed in relationship with nature, that when nature has changed or when there has been alteration to nature, how that has impacted the agrarian society in Europe, and how evolution of agrarian society or changes in agrarian society has impacted the nature in Europe. But when we come to the South Asian context, or when we come to the Indian context, the situation is more complex. Indian environmental history or the South Asian environmental history is perhaps more complex than European environmental history or American environmental history. The complexities of South Asian environmental history perhaps arises from the complexities of the society itself, because there is greater cultural diversity, there is greater ecological diversity in the South Asian context, and also there is greater species diversity which has facilitated and sustained greater diversified livelihood patterns. So therefore, the basic understanding of livelihoods or rural livelihoods with nature or different species, that becomes central in understanding environmental history in South Asia. So while understanding environmental history of South Asia, perhaps caste or social organization emerges as a dominant theme. because when we see caste, caste is not just a social categorization, it is not just a social and economic division of society. Caste also can be understood as an ecological division of society, because if you see caste system from an ecological perspective, we may realize that caste involves different groups or different occupational groups who have specific or exclusive access to certain resources, spaces or territory. In that sense, caste can also be understood as an ecological category. For example, we know that the caste of basket weavers, they have a specific control or they have a specific demand and access over natural resources. For example, they use bamboo for weaving baskets, or caste like carpenters, caste like goldsmiths. So they have a specific relationship with nature. Caste like those who deal with floriculture. So different castes have different ecological zones and ecological specializations. So caste can also be understood as an ecological category. The point I am trying to highlight here is that in the South Asian context, the social diversity exists along with ecological diversity, and caste groups not only differ in terms of their occupations, rituals or social distances, but also differ in terms of their specific relationship with natural environment. So therefore, the complexities of caste or the diversities of social organization and the diversities of ecology or ecological diversity, that makes environmental history in South Asian context a more complex affair. So therefore, South Asian environmental history or environmental history in South Asia has become more complex because the major themes of South Asian environmental history has been this diversity. So therefore, it is both the social diversity and the ecological diversity that becomes the major theme of South Asian environmental history. It tries to understand the changes in the physical status of forest, pastures and ecological diversity, as well as the changes in the social organizations governing the nature, social organizations with relation to different resource use. So South Asian environmental history focuses mostly on diversities of society, diversities of social organization, its changes over a period of time, as well as diversities of biological nature or biological diversities and its alterations or changes over a historical period of time. So in that sense, forest and water emerge as dominant themes in South Asian environmental history. From an environmental historical perspective, forest is not just a physical resource, but forest also becomes a home and a source of livelihood for the forest dependent communities. It becomes a source of fuel, it becomes a source of building materials and sustenance of life on earth. It also becomes relevant for its medicinal value, it becomes relevant for the cultural patterns that is produced, it becomes relevant as a source of raw material for a particular kind of economic organizations or a particular kind of production process, and it also becomes relevant for its role in agriculture and different kind of cultural patterns or social patterns that emerge in an agrarian society. So in that sense, forest from an ecological historical perspective is not just a biological or is not just a physical resource, but forest becomes a resource which has significantly evolved or which has significantly altered because of interventions of human action. Forest becomes a space for cultural representation. Forest becomes a factor for evolution of specific form of social and economic organization. Forest becomes an important component for development of a specific form of economic organization or the production process. So in that sense, forest is not just a physical resource, it becomes a larger space or it becomes a larger subject matter for understanding human society, for understanding economic organizations, for understanding cultural patterns and the changes in all these aspects or all these dimensions of society. The second element of environmental history in South Asian context is perhaps that of the pasture land. Around 6% of India's population depend upon pasture land for their livelihood purposes. So therefore, pasture land, so grazing land, emerge as another theme in environmental history in South Asian context. Even many agrarian civilizations or in many settled agriculturalists, they also depend upon pasture land for grazing. So therefore, the themes in environmental history concerning pasture land depends or it relates or it focuses on changes in the physical status of pasture land as well as institutional patterns involved in governing the use and management of this pasture land. So therefore, environmental history focuses how there has been a change in the land use pattern of this pasture land or grazing lands, and how change in the grazing lands or change in the pasture land has affected human society, how it has affected the communities. So the forest, pasture lands and water, they emerge as dominant themes in environmental history in South Asia. While water from a historical perspective has mostly been limited to understanding the maritime history, or where sea or where sea becomes or trade in sea becomes the major focus of history, environmental history focuses perhaps more importantly on the river basins. It focuses more importantly on history of river as a system of supporting agriculture. So therefore, history on great river systems or history on the river valleys, they become much more important from an historical or from an environmental historical perspective than that of the maritime trade or sea as a source as water. So in that sense, environmental history focuses on impact of natural environment, agrarian history and economic and social religions of the region. So here water becomes a significant source which defines or which determines religion, social organizations, economic life, cultural patterns and the overall dimensions of society. So in that sense, environmental history focuses on different water bodies that exist in close proximity with farm or with farmland. So it emphasizes on village ponds, it emphasizes on tanks, it emphasizes on channels, it focuses on rivers and how these water bodies have contributed for evolution of a particular kind of agricultural pattern or particular kind of agricultural social organization. So in that sense, environmental history focuses on small scale but effective systems of water use or water governance by local communities such as check dams, village tanks, small watersheds or traditional systems of water harvesting or water lifting. It also focuses on larger and more centralized systems of irrigation in the pre-colonial and the colonial times. For example, the canal systems of India, the river basins and the big dams. So in that sense, environmental history concerning water focuses on changing ecology of subsistence fishing or fishing rights of inland water bodies. It focuses how water or water body has contributed for evolution of a specific social organization. Water bodies which exist in the form of tanks, rivers, channels, canals or in different shapes and sizes, how that has contributed, how that has significantly influenced emergence or evolution of specific form of social and economic organization. So therefore, to summarize the major themes in environmental history, we may say that forest and water and grazing land, they have emerged as dominant themes in environmental history in the South Asian context. And while trying to understand these resources or these natural resources from historical perspective, environmental history in South Asia has focused on state control or state making over these resources. So therefore, environmental history, while tries to study colonialism or colonial history, points out or focuses how colonial patterns of forest management, colonial patterns of forest use and governance, colonial patterns of water management that has enabled the state to control new territories, that has enabled the state to capture new territories. So the focus has been on state as the principal actor in shaping human history. State has influenced environmental change by formulating different legislations pertaining to control and monopoly of natural resources. Especially focusing on forest, environmental history examines how colonial forest laws or colonial forest management practices has resulted in monopoly of forest as an important resource, and this monopoly of forest with scientific forestry or with scientific forest management by the colonial powers, that has had significant influence on the human society. So colonial history from an environmental social perspective becomes an history of forest, history of monopoly of forest, history of state making over forest, as well as a history of marginalization of communities because of this monopoly control of forest by the state. So in that sense, environmental historians like Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil have analyzed colonial history or colonialization as an ecological watershed in India. So they define colonialism as ecological imperialism, because it is the state power or the colonial state power which has monopolized over access and use of natural resources, and that monopoly of forest, monopoly over water, that has reshaped, that has fundamentally altered the nature of human society. The self-governing, self-sufficient rural societies has experienced a large transformation because of state monopoly over forest and state monopoly over water. When Ramchandra Guha says colonialism as an ecological watershed, Ramchandra Guha emphasizes on breaking down of symbiotic rural communities, breaking down of rural communities who have existed in close proximity with nature, in symbiotic relationship with nature, how that kind of community has been dismantled, has been destroyed because of colonial control, colonial monopoly of forest resources. And it is this colonial monopoly which has denied access to forest resources, which has denied dependence of livelihood upon forest resources, and that has created a new kind of social organization. That has created a different kind of social organization, and not only that has created a different kind of social organization, that also has created or that also has altered the basic nature or the physical characteristics of resource. So therefore, state making of forest or state control of forest during colonial rule has had a dual impact both on the natural resources as well as that of the community, and that becomes the central focus of environmental history. Similarly, the state making or the state control in water, where the British established several large scale dams on rivers, British established several canal irrigation systems, that has created a specific kind of control over water, and environmental history focuses on that aspect of state control, that aspect of state control over natural resources and its impact on local communities, its impact on those communities who depend upon these resources for their survival, for their livelihood, or for their everyday sustenance. So when we try to understand environmental history, and when we see environmental history in South Asia, both in relation to the large scale or the great biological diversity as well as the social diversity. So when we try to understand environmental history, and when we see environmental history in South Asia, both in relation to the large scale or the great biological diversity as well as the social diversity, and when we understand environmental history taking into account the livelihood connections that combines the nature and the society, we may realize that environmental history in South Asia for most part has been a history of contestation. So therefore, environmental historians say that environmental history in South Asia is not about the physical aspect of environment, or is not only about the ecosystem. Likewise, it is also not only about the human society and human society's place in nature. Rather, environmental history in South Asia can be best understood as a study of kind of people who competed for a share over mastery over nature. Or environmental history in South Asia becomes a site for contestation over nature, how different communities, different groups compete with each other, they fight with each other for putting a claim over the resource, for claiming the resource, or the environmental history in South Asia becomes a history of conflicts, a history of contestations surrounding nature, contestation concerning nature. And in that sense, there may be two broad influences of environmental history in South Asia. One of the important factors that determines or that has determined environmental history in South Asia is the very nature of development itself. The nature of modernized development, which were practiced in colonial times and which were intensified in post-colonial times or after independence, that has created a specific kind of claim over the nature. It has resulted in establishing a kind of monopoly, state monopoly over nature, and simultaneously it also has resulted in a kind of marginalization of local communities. So it is a specific historical development, or it is a specific history of development which has resulted in monopolization of nature, which has resulted in monopolistic control over nature by the state and exclusion of local communities from using the state as a source of livelihood. That has been a significant impact upon environmental history in South Asia, because this development, as environmental historians say, has been lopsided, they has been inegalitarian, and they have been exclusionary in nature, and that has created a specific pattern of resource use, a specific pattern of change in the natural resources or change in use of natural resources, as well as a specific changes in the community itself. So therefore, the specific historical experience of developmental patterns, developmental practices in South Asia, that has resulted in production of a specific unique kind of environmental history in South Asia. The second factor which influences environmental history in South Asia, which we just discussed, is the diversity. Because as we discussed, South Asia is diverse, or India is diverse, both in socio-economic sphere, or there is social diversity, as well as there is ecological diversity. And perhaps the situation becomes more complex where different diverse social groups, they have diverse, or they have different claims over the nature. They have different claims over the nature for their livelihood or for their subsistence. And it is these factors that significantly influence environmental history in South Asia. So therefore, when we are dealing with, or when we are trying to study environmental history of South Asia, when we are trying to historically examine environmental history in South Asia, perhaps we have to be careful, we have to be sensitive about these two factors: the history of development practice in South Asia, as well as the existing diversity in South Asia, diversity both in social terms, the social diversity, as well as the ecological diversity. So to summarize this part of the class, we may say that environmental history in South Asia has mostly focused on forest, water, and grazing land as important themes of environmental history. And while trying to research on environmental history, or while trying to study environmental history, we have to be clear, we have to have a clear understanding of the developmental practice, or the development as it has been practiced in colonial and post-colonial times, because it is this development practice which has resulted in a specific claim over resource, which has resulted in a specific kind of control and management of nature, and which has resulted in a specific kind of human society, or emergence of a specific kind of social and economic organization in human society.